Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, depending on where you are. Welcome to this event, Asian Embodiment of a White Canon, Shakespeare and East Asia, which is a part of a lecture series organized by the Center for Global Asia here at NYU Shanghai. For those who do not know me, my name is Anandi Rao. I'm a Global Perspectives on Society postdoctoral fellow here at NYU Shanghai. And I work on, among other things, Indian translations of Shakespeare. So it is a great pleasure to be introducing and discussing this lecture with all of you. Our speaker today is Professor Alexa Alice Joubin, who writes about race, gender, and globalization. As an indication of her multidisciplinary approach, she teaches in the departments of English, Women's and Gender and Sexuality Studies, Theater, International Affairs, and East Asian Languages and Literatures at George Washington University in Washington, D.C., where she serves as a founding co-director of the Digital Humanities Institute. She's also the co-founder and co-director of the MIT Global Shakespeare's website, which is this tremendous archive of Shakespeare performances from across the world, which I have found personally useful in my research and teaching. Today's talk is based on her latest book, Shakespeare and East Asia, which was published by Oxford University Press earlier this year. This book asks an important question. How might we decolonize hegemonic knowledge production about East Asia and its relationship with the West? Alexa offers new perspectives on cultural exchange in her book and considers Asian performing arts as original epistemologies rather than footnotes to the white Western canon. Alexa's work on race and gender across cultures is all the more relevant in the current political climate, when anti-Asian racism is frighteningly prevalent in the United States and xenophobic attitudes are on the rise. So now for some logistics. Alexa will speak for 35 to 40 minutes, after which I will offer a few brief comments and get the Q&A started. I invite all of you, especially those in Professor Hong's class, Chinese Identity and Global Perspective, to either type your questions and comments in the Q&A box through the lecture, or raise your hands and ask the questions. Thank you so much for attending, and I will now hand over the virtual screen to Alexa.
Hello everyone, what's in a name? That which we call a rose by an Asian name would smell as sweet or not. While the play Romeo and Juliet is propelled by the generations of dispute between the aristocratic Montague and Capulet, the film Chicken Rice War reduces the feud to the rivalry between the Wang and Chan families, who all compete in chicken rice stalls next to each other in an open-air food court in Singapore. No blood is spilled other than that of poultry. Languages and accents are important markers of racial identities in this multilingual film. Just like race, gender roles take on new meanings as well. An example behind me is Twelfth Night. Viola, disguised as a page boy, Cesario, is pursued by the lovelorn Olivia. When Viola declares that I am the man, she would better love a dream. She speaks with double irony with a doubly cross-dressed boy actors on the all-male early modern English stage. For example, Nathan Field, who passed away in 1619. In the all-female Japanese musical theater known as Takarazuka, as you can see on this poster, Viola would embody a new form of gender fluidity. In Kimura Shinji's 1999 production, Viola was played by an otokuyaku, an actress specializing in presenting sensitive masculinity of idealized male characters. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much, NYU Shanghai, for organizing this. I hope you got a preview out of the two very short examples that I've just given. It's a real honor to be introduced by Anandi. We last met at the conference on Indian women and Shakespeare in Belfast, in fact, and that was the very last in-person conference I attended before the pandemic hit. And of course, we're now in a different world now. The beauty of it, of course, is that I woke up early this morning and I'm giving this talk in Shanghai. It felt like teleportation. And this virtual format allows us to reach out to many of you in different parts of the world. So I definitely appreciate that. Thank you everyone for joining us. So I would like to start with a few words about my book's implication for Asian studies. My goal is to expand the purview of post-colonial studies, which tend to focus on British colonialism and Anglophone colonies. Countries that do not fully align with the narrowly defined colonial experience, such as China, Korea, and Japan, have been neglected. I want to decolonize the study of non-Western cultures and of the Western canon. I believe it is racist to regard non-Western films as merely footnotes to the white canon, as Anandi pointed out. My research reveals deep connections among different cultures. Since the 19th century, stage and film directors have mounted hundreds of adaptations of Shakespeare, drawn on East Asian motifs. And by the late 20th century, Shakespeare had become one of the most frequently performed playwrights in East Asia in many different genres. So as you can see on screen here, there are 5 fascinating aspects about Asian-themed performances. The first involves gender. Gender pronouns reveal themselves through word choices in East Asian films and productions. And these pronouns can reveal or conceal how much power a character might have over others. In Akira Kurosawa's film Throne of Blood, Macbeth and Lady Macbeth address each other with formal and informal gendered pronouns that betray their unease and desire for control. What stands out in the film is how and when some characters choose informal language. When conversing with each other, Washizu, Macbeth, and Mickey, Banquo, refer to each other with first names, deepen their voice, and use informal language and informal masculine I, ore. Washizu attempts to create a similarly intimate bond with Lady Asaji, his wife, in this scene, when in private, but she rejects his attempt and maintains verbal and physical distance. It is notable that when Washizu addresses Asaji, he does not use any honorific. He does not address her as Tsuma, wife, or Okusan, lady of the house. Meanwhile, Asaji uses the most formal, singular, first-person pronoun, watakushi, rather than the informal, feminine, atashi, which would be what the private conversation between a husband and wife normally entails. So this is significant. Asaji's combination of the formal watakushi and usually more casual anata, the latter here spoken and registered, that conveys condescension and rejects intimacy, that creates another layer of the uncanny beyond the atonal music. In the Takarazuka musical I mentioned in the beginning, Viola's Cesario was not the only cross-dressing character. Gender pronouns are especially fraught in this all-female production, with many, many layers of disguise. The Japanese language often elides the subject, as many of you know. In addition to making the right choice of employing the familiar or the polite register based on the relation between the speaker and the addressee, male and female speakers of Japanese are restricted by the gender-specific first-person pronouns available to them. Gender code switching creates semantic ambiguity and double irony. In general, syntactic limitations actually create linguistic opportunities in articulating anew all of these identities. For example, Duke Orsino's comments in 12th Night about love from masculinist perspective and Viola's apology for a woman's love when in disguise. This takes us to the second question, and this particular theme is prevalent in Chinese and Sinophone adaptations. Does Shakespeare always come to the rescue? The answer is not always. Some adaptations offer a corrective to Shakespeare's plays, such as Sherwood Hood's Tibetan film, Prince of the Himalayas. The film came out in 2006. It was shot and filmed entirely in Tibet with a Tibetan cast speaking Tibetan. So this is truly a landmark. The film gives Ophelia, as you can see on the screen here, a more active role through a remedial view of the dramatic action. Shakespeare's Gertrude's account of Ophelia recast her as, quote, mermaid-like. So she's a fairy tale creature, right? The Ophelia in this film becomes a goddess of nature, an immortal bride who returns to nature. The film still here shows that the scene pays tribute actually to pre-Raphaelite painter Sir John Everett Millet's Ophelia. Other works mark the conviction that Shakespeare has any recuperative function in a society, such as the Hong Kong comedy film One Husband, Too Many, directed by Anthony Chan in 1988. While the canonical status of Shakespeare's oeuvre has led to admiration and deference, there have been many witty parodies of the tragedy since the 1980s. The film dramatizes its characters' near quixotic insistence on performing and rehearsing Romeo and Juliet to ameliorate their conditions. Xin pins all his hope on bringing Western culture to, quote, backward village in Hong Kong by staging his version of Romeo and Juliet, with the costume and soundtrack borrowed from Franco Zeffirelli's 1968 film. In this still here, he takes on the role of Romeo and his wife plays Juliet. At this juncture, I would like to share a film clip, and afterwards I have a quick poll for our audience.
创啥哈？大概就是要放就放不出来，徛尾啦！
神呐，你夺去他冰糖一样的呼吸，他的体温，他的美貌，他的笑容。话题在有，月照泪影，情不在心，万般无情，面对绝境，心痛莫名。 我独留名，命必凋谢。
招你个头啊！
陪你，我愿到阴间当庄妃。神呐！
我仍然在黑布袋一般的地狱吗？ 冰冻的罗密欧啊，你要我脱下这贵族的丑陋外衣，温暖你的胸膛吗？
有好戏看嘞！
你为我而殉情，我该怎么办？我该怎么办呢？
爹，慢他了！爹！
As you can see, the performance is interrupted, and that is quite classic of anti-remedial Shakespeare adaptation, right? So the couple retreats backstage, they regain the courage to come back out to try to finish that scene with the help of the mayor. And I was struck by the use of different languages. You will hear the Minnan, Southern Min dialect, you will hear a bit of Cantonese as well as Mandarin, truly reflecting Hong Kong's hybrid status in the late 1980s, as well as its anxiety as British colonization was coming to an end. And as they come back out to finish that scene, something unusual happens. It really breaks the fourth wall. So you have the mayor's henchmen coming out, forming a line to defend them and saying anyone else who makes a fuss, right, will be beaten up.
为什么办他？我判谁？谁敢再吵我扁谁？阿志，是不是你在吵啊？老头，赶紧别接落来！阿哥，别讲干净啊！干净啊！拍手，不拍倒锤！哎，我怎么？是阿仔，你当我是阿仔，这不是你起笑的所在啦！刘大妹， 刘大便，刘大便是你叫的，你还要小便呢？啊！
不要这样嘛！现在演的是罗密欧与朱丽叶，又不是演线头牌吐鲁丸对四五丸。我只是想把。
And true to Shakespeare's spirit, in fact, right? Romeo and Juliet is not the greatest love story of all time. It is a very violent play. It's really about gang violence. I think the audiences got too deep into the play, I'm afraid, and they stormed the stage a second time. And so again, they are not the couple that are able to obtain closure. We shall revisit some of these things soon. Thank you all for joining the poll. I'm sharing the result here. As you can see, all of these are valid. Just we all take slightly different perspectives when we are confronted with a performance or a clip. The largest number of people here responded to the parodic aspect of this as a parody of Franco Zeffirelli, if you recognize the soundtrack, right? So this is truly not a parody, not just of Romeo and Juliet, but actually Franco Zeffirelli, the great Italian filmmaker's classic film. There's also the question of accents, as you've noticed, and the use of different languages to signal class struggle, right? All the characters, they actually have different levels of appreciation of Western classics. They are used to different languages. They respond to stage plays differently because they're not used to the Western style presentation. And of course, there's a framing device here, right? Being that this is a film about theater making. So the theater within a film is the framing device. And there's a lot of gender-based violence, especially toward the actress playing Juliet. Very unfortunately, all of the men sit down immediately thinking that Julius is about to give them a strict tease. So continuing the theme of gender, we actually have something, I discovered something quite unique in my research, that is transgender performance. In the late 1990s, to help change the image of South Korea abroad, the government began sponsoring the production of films and theater works. Within this context of the democratization of Korea, several South Korean adaptations of Hamlet recast Ophelia as a shaman who served as a medium to console the dead and guide the living. Because female shamans exist outside the Confucian social structure, they have greater agency. Inspired by political and academic feminism, these works rethought the position of Korean women in society. Although Ophelia has often been appropriated as a feminist symbol, she is now a site of contestation over gender identities and roles. The 2005 South Korean feature film was a box office hit, The King and the Clown, depicts the erotic entanglement among the three characters listed here. There's the king and their two acrobatic street performers, the macho Jang Sung, who plays male roles, and the trans feminine Gong Ji, who shares several personality traits with Hamlet's love interest, Ophelia, an inability to express oneself and a life largely determined by men. The transgender Ophelia character draws on the local culture of flower boys. The term flower boys refer to male identifying singer or actor known for the use of makeup and mannerisms that are considered socially to be feminine. Female fans live vicariously through androgynous characters like these without fear of being stigmatized as being promiscuous. The desire and sexuality of the female fans are complex. The fans may have lesbian tendencies, or they may be desiring ideal heterosexual men who rarely exist in reality. A scene in the court bears diagnostic significance. As you can see here, you have our Ophelia figure to the left. The courtesan Noksu storms in on the king and Ophelia in an intimate moment and taunts Ophelia about their real gender. The scene points to voyeuristic desires anchored in anatomy as an index to some truth about gender. Noksu tries to undress Ophelia in front of the king, creating a great deal of attention, presumably her dramatic act of gender revelation. is to expose Ophelia as an abject subject with alleged physical deficiencies and thereby dissuade the king from bestowing further favors on Ophelia. Such revelation scenes are a familiar device in transgender films. This is a device of exposure that subjects transgender characters to extra scrutiny. Such cinematic shock device enacts a struggle over the body's meanings. So from here, we move on to the fourth theme, which is race and accent, actually. So this section, titled Sounding Racial Differences, shows us how race and ethnicity are not only visible, but also audible, especially in multilingual films. An example is the Singaporean film Chicken Rice War that I mentioned at the beginning, built around the conceit of a college production of Romeo and Juliet. The film uses multilingualism as both a dramatic device and a political metaphor. The elder converse in Cantonese, while the younger generation speaks mostly Singlish or Singaporean English. Vincent and Audrey, in a mix of English and Cantonese, perform the balcony scene of Romeo and Juliet, in which the couple meet after the masked ball. Meanwhile, their offstage parents, as you can see here, become more and more impatient with their public display of affection, not understanding the boundary between playmaking and playgoing. Singapore's propaganda emphasizes commercial cosmopolitanism and international histories of immigration in the service of economic growth. Chicken Rice War critiques the idea that sounding white, speaking standard English, conveys more authority. So what do we make of all of this? There are deep connections among Asian and Anglophone performance cultures. They don't stand diametrically opposed. Chicken Rice War pointedly parodies Baz Luhrmann's campy film adaptation of Romeo and Juliet. And this is the opening scene. Once I play this, I will follow up with a scene from Chicken Rice War. It's a homemade trailer, and you would see the strong parallels between them. So first up, Baz Luhrmann's The Opening of Romeo plus Juliet. Obviously, you would notice the repetition of that famous prologue of Shakespeare, right? First by the female TV anchor, very detached, emotionally detached, a bit cold, right? On a deliberately antiquated TV set, followed by much more dramatic film trailer-like operatic replay, and this time accompanied by a deep, authoritative male voice reciting exactly the same words. Of course, this time we pair the words with image on screen to explain the words to the audiences. Thank you for joining us in the poll, and this is the result. I see today's audience, your interest almost equally split among the 5 themes, including parody, right? Here, Shakespeare's solemn tragedy is turned into a modern day evening news, right? News fair. And the use of framing device, of course, stands out quite strongly. The gender violence as well, perhaps not as strongly yet, though we have some footage. And it's definitely a question of class struggle. So it's interesting to see this, and we're going to pair this with Chicken Rice War and look at what happened in 2000 when a Singaporean filmmaker, by that time, Baz Luhrmann's film was already a global phenomenon. So this Singaporean filmmaker comes in, and this has to do something slightly different with a local twist, with a lot of direct references to actually DiCaprio, the star of this film.
2 families, both alike in dignity and profession, in fair Ang Mo Kio, where we lay our scene. From ancient grudge bred to new mutiny, when civil blood makes civil hands unclean. From forth the fatal loins of these 2 foes, a pair of star-crossed lovers choose their chicken rice.
What are you saying? Do you think Mr. Tan and Ang Mo Kio can understand you? When I told you not to speak in Singlish, I didn't ask you to sound like Shakespeare. Do it again. Do it again.
play, may I be so bold as to ask for a chance to read Romeo?
What makes you think that you can be Romeo?
What makes you think you can play Romeo?
You don't have the looks, and you can't even speak properly. Nick, on the other hand, he looks like Leonardo DiCaprio. That's why he's Romeo. Do you think you look like Leonardo?
Yeah, I agree.
Hey, look. Came my day. This is my first time to play, you know.
No, where the hell did you get that suit from anyway?
My friend works in a bridal shop. Very expensive.
Very ugly.
Tonight we're here to see a very high-class play, so we're all dressed very nicely.
So the person in the middle, he is the chicken supplier. He supplies chicken to both families who run chicken rice stores in Singapore's hawker center. And he plays the role of chorus in Shakespeare, as well as the priest who tries to keep the peace. And that's exactly what he's doing here. He assigns them to seats left and right, much like at a wedding, where the families of the bride and the groom would be on different sides of the aisle.
Very high class, huh? Tonight, let's keep all the business at the hawker center, okay? Maybe it's a good idea that the two families sit separately, huh? 我睇你坐呢邊，阿生你坐呢邊，我坐中間 keep the peace, huh?
Lips that they must use in prayer.
個肥婆個仔啊，同阿 Audrey 講嘢，好大膽喎！老婆 ，I know Audrey is being Juliet，咁啊 she act with 啲死肥婆生。
But then they're saying, let lips do what hands do. They pray, grant thou less.
你皇姑個仔啊，又靚仔啊，又識得做戲啊！你個女啊，身材啊，好似洗衫板啊，做戲啊，木口木面啊，唔襯啊！
係啊，呢塊咁嘅洗衫板啊，我睇送上門啊，我個仔都唔幫睺佢啊！
真係，陳生 ，we're trying to be very high class, you cannot argue here.
Thus from my lips I dine, my sin is purged.
Then have my lips to sing that
又
they
瘦
are
又醜樣，癩喊想食天鵝，唔知咩新絲蘿蔔片。
Sin from my lips, trespass with the edge, give me my sin again.
嚇！你睇個死姣婆啊！你睇佢喐你我個仔啊！你睇下，你想話唔係想蝦我個仔啊，攞咗我啲飛。
What was your stupid recipe？人家賣雞飯，你又賣雞飯，你放假關你咩事啊？嚇！你先賣雞飯，唔係雞先賣，你先賣雞飯。
Just like in One Husband Too Many from Hong Kong, the unruly audiences, or rather the lower class audiences, they eventually disrupt the play. So they bring their world to crash the world of the play. As you can see, I'm sharing the poll result here. Thank you all for joining us. The most significant feature, I think, for most people today here is actually accents, right? You can hear the parents kind of mixing Cantonese, primarily Cantonese, with some Mandarin. And the younger generation, they are trying to perfect English following Singapore's Speak Standard English campaign, right? On stage only to be interrupted by local forces. And accents and languages are really, really important markers of class difference, but also the so-called divide between the families, right? Due to this ancient feud. So in Chicken Rice War, the reflexive role of the chorus is split among the English-speaking newscaster we saw in the opening, and the Malay character who sings a version of the prologue as Cantonese opera at her beverage stall. Now, another example of the connections here, as we've seen in One Husband Too Many, that film features costumes reminiscent of Danilo Donati's doublet and tights design for Franco Zeffirelli's Romeo and Juliet, to the tune of that film's A Time for Us by Nino Rota with new Cantonese lyrics. So you can see the parallel here on screen, which makes it really obvious how they really try to imitate and mock that classic. So both the Hong Kong film and the Singaporean film, they really go to great effort to excavate not just Shakespeare, but actually renowned modern versions and propose a local response to those globalized films. Here's another example showing the deep, unexpected connections between Sinophone Asian cultures and Anglophone performances. So here is a scene from Michael Amarida's Hamlet. And this film appropriates Asian spirituality. The film came out in 2000. It is Buddhist inflected. It's set in 21st century Manhattan. So the Vietnamese monk Thich Nhat Hanh here on the screen, in the TV on the screen, is featured in a spin-off of the to be or not to be speech. So what do these deep connections tell us? I believe there are three main themes. There are deep connections among adaptations that extend through different media and genres. Several works examined in this book are products of meta-cinematic and meta-theatrical operations. Kurosawa used traditional Japanese theatrical elements in his film of Macbeth. His signature long shots, which remained emotionally detached, are echoed in Yukio Ninagawa's stage productions. Multilingual films such as Chicken Rice War counter the narratives about universal literary experience. They compel us to work with rather than work out of the space between languages. I've noticed how subtitles can, on the one hand, erase difference, and on the other hand, recognize difference, with an eye toward equality. There are deep connections among adaptations from different cultures. Appreciating these connections help us transcend what I call compulsory realpolitik, the third and last point on the slide here. This is a conviction that the best way to understand non-Western works is by interpreting the engagement with pragmatic politics. This approach may imply that non-Western works are of interest only for their political testimonial value. It tends to characterize a non-Western artwork based on stereotypes of its nation of origin. For example, South Korean adaptations are always political allegories of the post-war tensions on the Korean Peninsula. Compulsory realpolitik could imply that works from the global South or Asia are valuable only for their political messages rather than their aesthetic merits. This assumption leads to research questions driven by polity. For example, why are there so many global Shakespeare adaptations in cultures with, quote, no love for Great Britain? Obviously, you don't have to love Great Britain to engage with Shakespeare. Anglophone Shakespeares are assumed to have broad theoretical applicability and aesthetic merits, whereas, quote, foreign Shakespeares, even when they focus on artistic innovation on a personal rather than epic scale, are compelled to prove their political worth. Critics are on the lookout for potentially subversive political messages in these works, which are compulsorily characterized as allegories of geopolitical issues. As a result, works by non-white authors are imagined to fix their intellectual content by way of a national, ethnic, or cultural location. Western white examples are assumed to be more effective in their explanatory power, while African, Asian, and Latin American materials are recruited to serve as the exceptional particular. What's so important here, I think, in Asian embodiment of a white canon is that this gives us a category we can use to develop site-specific critical vocabulary to address the blind spots created by compulsory realpolitik. Asian embodiment of white canon is not and should not always be political. Stories of political oppression must be told, but dichotomized views do not get us very far. Cross-cultural adaptations can also promote self-reflexivity on social and personal levels. The self-reflexivity promotes the awareness of the theatricalization of difference. The performances are therefore productive in the sense that they are generative. They engender evolving ideas of a white canon, of Asian modes of embodiment, of expression. Adaptations are energized by internal divisions and pathways, and adaptations therefore, in conclusion, are the prodigal child that ultimately expands the riches of human civilization. In conclusion, I would like to share a fun pictures when my book just came out earlier this year. This is the day when the book arrived, and we just got our pandemic puppy, like a lot of people. So my dog was actively perusing my new book.
Thank you so much, Alexa, for this rich and inspiring talk. Before I begin my official comments, I want to share two opportunities for our audience members in Shanghai. The first is an exhibition titled Ophelia at the Museum of Art Pudong. This exhibition will run till November 28th and features John Everett Millais' Ophelia, which Alexa referenced in her talk. The scene that Alexa showed us from the Tibetan film Prince of Himalayas references this image. So if you're interested in seeing the Millais' version of Ophelia, you can go do so in Pudong till the end of this month. And the exhibition also includes Chinese translations of Shakespeare for those who are interested. The second is that Sleep No More, an immersive Macbeth-inspired experience, is also playing in Shanghai. I have had the opportunity to see it twice, and this experience made me think about one of the themes from Alexa's book that really resonated with me and my work with non-Anglophone Shakespeare. This is the relationship between the familiar and the unfamiliar. Because Sleep No More in Shanghai was both familiar with my recognition of elements in Macbeth and unfamiliar in so many ways. In the prologue of Shakespeare and East Asia, Alexa writes that, quote, performing Shakespeare in Asian styles has constituted an act of defamiliarization for audiences at home and abroad, end quote. Through the diverse and really interesting examples in the book and the talk, Alexa has shown us that that which is familiar in a production shifts depending on the context, the location, the audience, and the critic. Importantly, familiarity can also lead to transparency, and certain elements can be overlooked. So one example of this from the book and the talk is the example from the 2005 South Korean film, The King and the Clown. As you demonstrated in the talk, Gong Jil is quoted as trans feminine in the film, but as you say in the book, a lot of, owing to their familiarity with narratives of the deal with homosexuality, most critics and audience members misgendered Gong Jil and did not recognize her as a trans feminine character. And the trans femininity was invisibilized. So I thought this was really interesting. Thinking about Shakespeare, and this leads to my second point about canonization and canon building. A question that arises for me is whether Shakespeare can, is there a point right now where Shakespeare cannot be defamiliarized anymore, owing to perhaps globalization? But also thanks to the rich Asian tradition of engagement with Shakespeare, as you say, from the 19th century. The building perhaps of a canon of Asian interpretations and adaptations of Shakespeare that reference each other now. Perhaps Shakespeare cannot be defamiliarized for audiences, and perhaps even Asian Shakespeare is no longer defamiliarized. So these are some thoughts. But the biggest interest that I had in this book was given my long-held interest in multilingualism and translation. Several parts of this book that engage with these issues really resonated most deeply with me. So I think one example that you mentioned in your talk was about gender pronouns, especially in Kurosawa's Throne of Blood. I think I was thinking about this in terms of how English subtitles would capture the nuances of these gendered pronouns and these degrees of interpersonality and not interpersonal relationships and these different degrees of intimacy. So I was thinking about whether working between languages, as you put it, or in a translingual space allows for expression of different gender and social identities and desires that working within the limits of one language does not. The chapter on multilingualism, including the examples from Chicken Rice War, as you mentioned in the talk, and the work of Ong Keng Sen, made me think a lot about how multilingual works can both challenge and resist and reinforce certain nationalistic narratives and chauvinisms. Now, perhaps I'm falling into a trap of compulsory realpolitik here. However, I want to focus on the echoes with Derridean monolingualism, as you do cite from Derrida in the book. And for those unfamiliar with Derrida, in Monolingualism of the Other, one of his postulations is we only ever speak one language. Yes, but we never speak only one language, end quote. Another way to look at this Derridean monolingualism is as Radhakrishnan does when he says that, I quote, the monolingualism of the other is but a thematic variation of the multilingualism within the self, end quote. So for me, both the monolingualism of the other and the multilingualism of the self speak to intralingual, intra-identitarian non-homogeneity. While they don't make it explicit, both these concepts can also be extrapolated to push back against notions of racial impurity that undergird certain constructions of the nation, of nativism and linguistic chauvinism. Anglophone and even non-Anglophone Shakespeares have been used to bolster certain kinds of chauvinism. And this is where I find Alexa's range of examples, use of the term Sinophone, and the critique of compulsory realpolitik, and the whiteness of Shakespeare studies really inspiring and useful. So thank you for this really wonderful talk and rich talk. The first question, to get the Q&A going, the first question that I have is more methodological. And this is especially since the talk is part of the Center for Global Asia lecture series. I was wondering how you understand the terms Asia and East Asia, because you make a compelling argument in the book about why the book is titled Shakespeare and East Asia and not Shakespeare in East Asia. But I was wondering about the term East Asia itself. And I guess where I'm coming from and relatedly to this is the use of the framing of intercultural theater and cross-cultural adaptations, and whether these terms, intercultural and cross-cultural, engage with particular notions of Asia or East Asia.
Thank you, Anandi, for this in-depth, wide-ranging commentary. Deeply appreciated. Thank you for taking time to indulge me and to read the book. And the other questions you raised are profoundly connected, I think, to the sense of equity that we're building toward today. And I'm going to start with your last question about Asia versus East Asia. So obviously, I do deal with Southeast Asian, one is Southeast Asian location, Singapore. But for the sake of the title, we decided to go with only East Asia. In the sense that when I used East Asia, I'm referring to specific geopolitical region that works coming out of that. But actually, East Asia also is a floating signifier in the sense that, for example, Almarida's Hamlet, right? They appropriate Vietnamese as well as traces of Chinese Buddhism for that film. That film itself was not by East Asian directors. They didn't feature East Asian artists, right? So East Asian as floating signifier is a cultural symbol to be borrowed, even by white directors. And that's one point I want to make in the book. So not Shakespeare in East Asia or from East Asia. Yes, there are examples that might speak to that. And I pay a special attention to female artists within East Asia. But I more often discuss appropriations of East Asian values or motifs in touring productions, in Western artist works, in British East Asian theatre, for example, in the UK, multilingual film from Singapore, and even there's a section where I briefly discuss in chapter 2, Asian American adaptations of Not Macbeth by Kurosawa. So that's an interesting journey. And because of this, I can't use in, right? I think Shakespeare and East Asia make more sense. So the question of Asia, obviously, for brevity, my title's talk today is Asian Embodiment of White Canon, but of course, I couldn't have possibly included all Asian, right? In the entire Asia, which is too huge an articulation to actually fully engage. I think I used it more loosely in the sense of Asian versus Anglophone, in the same way as when we say Anglophone covers so many regions. One special feature of my book is that there are 2 tables of contents. You're looking at the simplified one, organized thematically rather than geographically. When you write a book like this, in comparative literature, crossing different regions, the first question, of course, do you organize it chronologically or geographically? Do you move from Japan to China to Korea to Singapore? I decided to do it primarily thematically, so across time periods to showcase transhistorical evolution. But to keep the discussion manageable, I think there are so many variables, readers will get lost. So even though at first blush, chapter 1 discusses formalistic features, while chapter 2 talks about using Shakespeare for socially reparative purposes and so on. If you go to the alternative table of contents, you can see which plays are being discussed and in which genres. And you would also get a sense that actually chapter 1 draws primarily from Japanese examples to keep things coherent. Chapter 2, primarily Chinese Sinophone, and so on. So that's the organization. That's also how I unpack the notion of Shakespeare and East Asia. The question of canonization, Anandi raised, most excellent. I think we need to think about not just canonization of global Shakespeare, but actually canonization of East Asian performance genres on stage and on film through engagement with a commodity that circulates more widely globally. And so that in itself, I think, is a form of canonization. That Tibetan film, right? Prince of Himalayas. I'm afraid it may not have been funded or even made. It's really to feature Tibetan talents. It's even a Tibetan language film. It's a very rare Tibetan language film. So in that instance, Shakespeare's canonicity helps the canonization of Tibetan film. And I think that's a beautiful thing. Now, can we de-familiarize Shakespeare any further, given that we are in 2021 and there are so many parodies? I'm afraid yes, because it's so canonical, this endless string of not necessarily parodies, but engagement coming up, right? If you think of the balcony scene, it's so iconic. You think about a young man holding a skull. I think a lot of people, without knowing the whole text of Hamlet, would say that looks like Hamlet. And I think the status of these characters as icons lend themselves to out of context quotations. There would be allusions, not full appropriations of Shakespeare, but often in films that has nothing to do with Shakespeare. I find surprising, short, like brief allusions, even though they are very brief and really out of context, they still bear weight just because Shakespeare bears weight. So linguistic chauvinism is the last very important thing you mentioned, Derridian monolingualism. Derrida, as I quote in the book, famously says that he did French is not his native language. It's just astonishing. He's a naturalized citizen of France, right? From Algeria. French is his native tongue, but what he meant by native is that he doesn't own the language, right? Its grammar, its semantics, its rules were made elsewhere. He did not make it up. So in that sense, you can't own it. And I think that's illuminating for us in this era of not only culture, but also political conflict, right? We don't really own even your so-called native language or culture. Nobody owns Shakespeare, even if you're a native speaker. And you are right, Anandi. I think this linguistic chauvinism sometimes being promoted, even inadvertently, in promotion of Shakespeare. Here, allow me to conclude by quoting Derrida. He says that not only he doesn't own the language, but we don't speak the language speaks us. That's a typical deconstruction move and kind of post-structuralist, inspires post-structuralism. So by the idea that language speaks us is that you do not have full control of all those rules, and therefore your thought patterns may be governed by the logic of a particular language when you are in that language.
Thank you, Anandi, and thank you, Alexa, for this extremely scintillating talk. I really learned a lot. I have one question that has to do with your various discussions of gender through the variety of examples that you raised, which I find extremely interesting, given the kind of perhaps not necessarily rebellious, but I see and detect a lot of insubordinate moments. And I don't know whether that ties in to your discussion of heteroglossia, and some of the Sinophone networks. I'm particularly picking up on some of the Sinophone films that you're using here. So I'm wondering, one thing that I noted, which is striking to me, is that you throughout your book and this talk, you talk a lot about quotations, right? Adaptations, remakes, and the citational quality or gesture, of these insubordinate gender politics. But it's striking to me that you're discussing it not necessarily using the existing and yes, admittedly, quite Euro-American centric, kind of gender studies, theory. So you're not, necessarily using that language, right? But you are situating, these insubordinate gender moments within your study of theater and performance. So I find that extremely mind-opening. So my question is, what kind of perhaps, in what ways could perhaps you think the performance studies of Shakespeare and the kinds of global adaptations and disseminations of Shakespearean works helps us rethink the kind of gender studies that we're doing right now. How does performance studies help us rethink the existing network of paradigms that we have been using, but perhaps insufficient in some way? I feel like this seems to be a constantly surfacing theme throughout the chapters, but you don't seem to necessarily use a overarching kind of network framework, right, to talk about it. So I'm curious to hear you perhaps share more your thoughts on this.
Thank you so much, Selena. I think that is such a key area. Rebellious, insubordinate gender performances. Obviously, Shakespeare is usually foreign in this context, and so artistic. I think artists sees that they may not be able to stage this kind of works with a local script, and I think there's this general tendency to use something that is usually foreign as an excuse to experiment, as well as something that is canonical and supposedly familiar. Romeo and Juliet is familiar to world audiences in a particular way, right? The greatest love story of all time. Most audiences do not pause and think about the fact that the play is fast-paced and it's really more about violence. Never mind that, the iconic status as a love story that allows the directors to come in, to massage it, to work with it, to work out of it. And as a result, you are right. We see more insubordinate performances of gender roles through this. I'm surprised, for example, by Kurosawa's creative engagement with gender pronouns in an otherwise conservative, masculinist samurai film, Throne of the Blood. And all those points were actually mostly glossed over, if not overlooked, by English scholarship. So Kurosawa, I have to mention for those of you who are not in the field, is actually very canonical in Shakespeare studies. It's one of the most canonical, side by side with Kenneth Branagh, Laurence Olivier, partly because his films entered into the discourses very early on. So for years, people would teach Kurosawa with subtitles, without worrying about Japanese context in the Shakespeare classroom with all the other canonical films. And the problem is the subtitles, as you know, we talked about subtitles, how it can actually conceal certain things, that all the gender pronouns, the nuances would not come through, right? Because you translate into I, just a single I in English, while in Japanese, there's so many different pronouns for I. And you're right that quotation is actually a political act. The copious quotations of Shakespeare, quotations of Asian, East Asian cultural elements, I think those are really important. I want to answer your important question about methodology, about gender. So I am working on something new at the moment, and I do use more of the language of Western gender studies, for better or for worse. I want to note the power of performance, and this is in line with feminist moves to use performance as a tool to debunk gender roles, right? Because performances peel back layers and layers of articulation. So any gender expression in this view is inherently performative. So the performing arts are an important tool for tackling sexism, given their power of embodied representation. And all gender practices, therefore, can be transformative. As we've seen in all of those examples, the Hong Kong film One Husband Too Many, the wife playing Juliet, she's shocked by the intruding audience, so she forgets her lines, and she improvises and talks about like taking off the royal dress. That's not actually in Shakespeare or in their own script. And that prompts the male audience to sit down right away, expecting straight teeth. Seeing that, she improvises further, strap it and scrape it, and let's move on, right? So that's just an example of how performances can change on the spot. And that is not to say, however, that performances only have positive effects. I think to take a performative lens, we have to be very careful what the performative lens can do to gender, especially in the context of transgender theory, because these detractors often accuse trans people of performing to pass as someone else, to deceive the society. So on one hand, the notion of performative gender expressions pioneered by Judith Butler, that notion has been misappropriated by anti-trans groups to invalidate trans life. And it has also been rejected by activists on that ground. They say it's harmful. On the other hand, performance can actually be socially reparative, as we've seen. They reveal something, it's not indoctrinating. Someone will go see Chicken Rice War or One Husband Too Many, and maybe it'll dawn on them, Julia could be played a bit differently. It may be ludic, right? It may be kind of, it's not worshipping Shakespeare, but that's just a platform to launch the beginnings of these conversations. So that's what I call reparative. And performative could be reparative through characterization, through representation, self-representation. I was really struck by the Japanese all-female tradition. That's kind of to counter the all-male Kurosawa kabuki tradition. So Takarazuka has been immensely empowering for actresses and for their female fan base. So that's a very unique phenomenon. Also Flower Boy, right? In Japan and Korea, begin to see those coming out in films. Again, using Shakespeare as an excuse to start all of these experiments. I think Shakespeare has been playing perhaps a surprising role throughout East Asian cultures, more surprising than most people care to look. But he has been there for 2 centuries in different forms of translations. And Shakespeare being standard English is actually highly problematic, even for English speakers, as you may know. He wrote in a time before spelling was standardized, right? And so each published book, even within the Shakespearean would spell the same words differently. There are so many variations of his own name, whether it ends with an E or not, for example. And so the lack of standardization is actually quite interesting, as well as the particular twists of Elizabethan English, which is actually, if you hear someone speak it, you would recognize the linguistic, historical, cultural distance between that language and the global English we use today. And so that in itself speaks to debunks the myth of Shakespearean English being the ultimate standard. If someone were to study English today, right, you wouldn't want to send them to Shakespeare, perhaps, because there's a huge historical gap between modern English and Elizabethan English. In other words, treat it as a not historical curiosity, but it's actually a very particular historical product. Not as distant as Chaucer's English, as in Old English, which is a separate language you will actually have to master as a medievalist. The problem with Shakespeare's proximity to ours is that it's almost but not quite. And so there are people who would assume, especially native speakers, who assume that they have natural access to Shakespeare. So that naturalized concept is itself problematic. I think Sandra is also asking about where did Shakespeare learn this craft and all. That's a slightly different topic, but the answer is actually no. There's no mentor to teach Mr. Shakespeare all this great thing. He actually learned very quickly, like a sponge, from his contemporary, whatever is trendy, for example. I mean, others learn from him too. He wrote Merchant of Venice, which inspired Marlowe's plays that's actually very, very similar to it. And so you can see that that culture produces similar stories just because the previous one was the box office hit. And a lot of it's actually commercial consideration. So I don't want to further canonize or promote the admiration of Shakespeare as some kind of genius. He's a very pragmatic concern as well. And he wrote very specifically for members of his cast, famous tragedian Richard Burbage, for example. A lot of roles are designed for him. So Adira's very important question. I think you are absolutely right. By compulsory realpolitik, I should explain better. I meant international politics, as in the sense of in international affairs, they would gloss over, say, Nobel Prize winner Gao Xingjian, for example, or from another country, the artistic merits. They would favor discussion of how that work reflects oppression, reflects specific problems on the ground politically. And so that work comes to represent the problems of that country and the specific love for dissidents. So that's what I meant by compulsory realpolitik. And the other things, yes, I mentioned, the other things are political, but not in the sense of not political in the sense of how international affairs as a field likes to misuse Asian art. So for example, class conflict, racism, particularly through accents and so on, genderism, right? They are deeply political on a different level, not in the sense of national profiling, like characterizing a whole nation through Kurosawa's Throne of Blood. Yes, people have done that. Yes, the work lends itself to that discussion. Throne of Blood is a product of post-war Japan, right? It reflects partially the director's disillusionment after the disillusionment with humanity, who has the capacity to hurt each other, and so on. So that's what I call the epic scale. But on a personal scale, a work like that can also be quote unquote political on a personal scale in terms of its revisions to traditional gender roles, for example. So that's not national, international politics. But thank you for raising that, and thank you for giving me this chance to clarify.
Yes, I wonder if I can ask a follow-up question.
Go ahead, Selena.
Yes, looking at Adira's question, I think that was so interesting. And thank you, Alexa, for talking about the idea and how you sort of conceive this problem of realpolitik. So I guess my question is related to that in the sense that all of a sudden now, having read your work on global Shakespeare, I'm wondering, and please correct me if you feel that this is the wrong way of seeing Shakespeare in that globalized lens. I wonder what might be the implication of thinking about the global adaptation of Shakespearean work, or Shakespeare, okay, the term itself as a kind of open signifier. I'm thinking particularly in relation to, for example, within the growing field of Sinophone studies, right? How people have been thinking critically, right, about this catch-all phrase, Chineseness, right? So I'm thinking what might be the multiple implications of reading Shakespeare, okay, in a similar lens. Is there something that we are diluting here by conceptualizing Shakespeare as a kind of open signifier, or is there something radical about this way of looking at Shakespeare? This is not a very well conceived question, but it just pops out of my head, and so I'm curious to hear more.
Thank you so much. You mentioned Chineseness. Do you have Englishness in mind?
Yeah,
Chinese
perhaps.
Works versus what Shakespeare is.
Perhaps. I'm thinking about this also partially because I'm now teaching a course on Chinese identity and global perspective, right? And the way in which that we are seeing all of these global examples related to Shakespeare seems very tempting for me to make some kind of an interpretive analogy here, and to think about a similar set of perhaps intellectual or political stakes. So I'm just wondering very openly about what intellectual stakes or gains or promises we might be getting.
For too long, Asian engagement with Western classics has been glossed over due to compulsory realpolitik and due to what I call colorblind gaze. So this colorblind gaze is, I think, especially prominent in US and UK today. The academia has turned its attention to racism, and there's a lot of discussion of racialized performances or even racial biases in casting and so on, but they never turn their gaze outwards. So as if in Asian performances, there's no race. There's race only if there's an African-American production of Hamlet, and we talk about race or multi-ethnic casting in the UK. I see that as a big problem, and that's a colorblind gaze. When they gaze at non-Western work, they don't think of race as if race automatically suddenly doesn't exist. They only exist when when people of color intrude into the American mainstream society. And I think that's a real flaw in academic studies today. So this relates to your question of Chineseness and Chinese identities in global perspectives. We need to get rid of our colorblind gaze, whichever direction we look. I think Chinese identities in from a global perspective really pushes us to answer difficult and even uncomfortable questions, precisely what is Chineseness, right? Perhaps it's co-constituted by Chinese cultural production and global perception effect. There's never, obviously, to go back to Derrida, as Anandi so capably evoked, there's no identity without the other, right? You always define yourself in opposition to something you are not. Otherwise, I mean, especially national identities, I think it's very fraught at this kind of crossroads. So the same could be said of Englishness. If you look at Shakespeare's plays, within the plays, is Shakespeare an open signifier? Yeah, yes, today it is, because he has largely been detached from Englishness. People don't appropriate Shakespeare to say, I love England. Or they appropriate Shakespeare saying, I think fewer and fewer artists today say that, the greatest playwright of England. They would say, oh, the world's most famous playwright and so on, or Romeo and Juliet. They always talk about the world. And I find that really intriguing. So in that sense, Shakespeare is an open signifier. But if you look at the plays themselves, how does Englishness manifest themselves? So ironically, among his peers, right, during Renaissance playwrights from that era, he's the least English. He incorporates Welsh accents. He makes fun of Italians, dreams about emulating Venice. That's a common thread within Londoners of his time, thinking that London would be next Venice, kind of the global city, and so forth. So if you look at just the settings of his plays and where the characters come from, lots and lots of Italian characters, very few of his plays are actually set in England proper. So in that sense, you can say he engages in a sense of kind of proto-globalism, but also perhaps that's how Englishness was defined, right? Have to always look outward and say, then this is who we are, because we are not Welsh or Italians.
Okay, there are a lot of questions on gender, and I think one has to do with how these artworks, whether it is in terms of gender representation or the representation of trans characters, how they shape the society that receives them, not just how they are shaped by the society that produces them, and the relationship between transgender characters and Shakespeare. If you would like to speak more on that, that might be interesting.
Twelfth Night, I mentioned at the very beginning, this is a comedy with what some people call cross-dressing, mistaken identities. So Viola is shipwrecked on the shore of a fictional country, Illyria, and she ends up having to disguise herself for her safety, right? So she pretends to be a eunuch, a page boy, in order to serve the Duke, in order to survive. What's so interesting throughout that, so she calls herself Cesario, and you really don't meet Viola that much, just the opening few lines, and then you have Cesario throughout. At the very end, when there's gender reveal, her identity is revealed, you still see her. She just doesn't change back. The excuse is the captain has my maiden's weed. So captain goes to retrieve it, but she remains in male disguise. How do you read a play like this? Traditionally, of course, people say, cross-dressing, empowerment, because it's so-called female to male cross-dressing, but maybe it's time we take the cutting-edge transgender theory of our time to reread a character like this. Maybe Cesario is really who this character is. Forget about Viola. And that has profound implications. So I hope that answers part of the question in terms of relationship between the so-called transness and Shakespeare. It's like race, right? When people started discussing race, they open a can of worms and like, oh, there's race in Shakespeare. So same here, you see, oh, there's gender identity, but also the not so binary identity in this. Why would Shakespeare write something like this? Well, part of the answer is that in his times, women were prohibited from playing on stage, on the public professional stage. So all of these were actually played by boy actors. And he's, you might say from dramaturgical point of view, having fun with so many layers. He's a boy actor playing Viola who pretends to be a boy, who is very clumsy at being a boy, and yet underneath the clothes, that's actually a boy actor. So that really, from my perspective, that kind of gender fluidity demands transgender theoretical exploration, right? How else are you going to read this? The cross-dressing, that's such a tighter perspective. Being explored for 4 decades in Shakespeare studies no longer enough. So the transgender theory can make legible some really obscured aspects of these characters. It can debunk the myth that transgender identity is exclusively modern phenomenon. Actually, since the Middle Ages, there's a lot of this. So I'm going to share very quickly in the chat. I'm at the beginning of this work, and this is an essay I wrote that just came out. I do exactly what I said here. I'm trying to apply transgender interpretation to Shakespeare and see what happens, instead of just doing feminist or queer studies. So bringing trans theory to Shakespeare can help us revise our thinking about familiar characters, right? Viola, what if they are really Cesario? Because how do you explain this? Throughout the story, you really only follow Cesario. And we can recognize non-binary figures in history, and we can change our approach to performance. And despite the gender fluidity in Shakespeare, right? But many performances have been read as normative in the sense that it's male or female, and it's cross-dressing, right? The very word cross-dressing implies that you have to cross over. So when I discovered the Korean movie King and Clown, I was really blown away. Oh, someone is doing something really unusual, and it's about Ophelia, right? Rather than one of the cross-dressing comedies. So the transgender theory can correct an institutionalized sexism. By sexism, I mean that people assume that the characters, even if they are fluid, but we assume that they are binary male or female. And then everything follows from there. You also assume they're heterosexual, and so on. But a play like 12th Night really demands more, because Cesario's relationship to Olivia, who falls in love with him. There's also the Duke, right? There's this, it's hardly a heterosexual play.
And thank you for doing that work. I think that's really important work. One question that is coming up again and again is the distinction between how you use white and non-white, perhaps, and like the relationship between ethnic meanings on like non-white plays.
There are white directors, white actors. Kenneth Branagh doing Hamlet versus, by non-white, I mean not just Black directors, but Asian American directors, but Asian directors within Asia or British East Asian, like David Tse, who's originally from Hong Kong, but does theater in England, for example. So how do you wrestle with the different reception, the difference in reception of the works by these people? Branagh did an As You Like It, filmed in California, but it's set in Edo, Japan. So very often it's been criticized as a white director's Japanese dream and so on. How is that different, however, from Kurosawa or Ninagawa's uses of Japanese symbols? Perhaps we need to be critical as well of the non-white directors, the Asian directors. They could very much engage in their own form of Orientalism, but just because of their identity, sometimes they are absolved. And of course, we need to be critical of white directors' misappropriation of other cultures. There's a power relationship here, right, to think about. That's what I meant by white and non-white writers, and because the reception very often reflects what people think about their personal identities.
Thank you very much, Alexa, for your really inspiring talk and wonderful book. And I encourage everyone who's still with everyone to go read the book and learn more about some of these really fascinating examples that you bring up. So thank you for your time. Thank you all for your wonderful questions that has allowed us to have this rich discussion. And thank you, Center for Global Asia, Hauja, Selena, for organizing this event.